Hey everyone, this is Raptor Chatter, and we're going to be looking at some of the biggest papers of March 2023 in paleontology. And let's get started. The first thing we're going to be looking at is actually just kind of some housekeeping with the animal Ubirajara. Ubirajara is this really interesting case and almost kind of textbook case of scientific colonialism, because the fossil is from Brazil but was smuggled out of Brazil to Europe, where the researchers then studied it, and this is against Brazilian law. One of the authors also had some interesting comments about having researchers who aren't white working with them. So it's definitely a significant issue in the paleontology field that this kind of thing continues to happen and is more likely to continue pushing people from poorer countries like Brazil and the global south out of paleontology. Now, this report is basically just from the International Commission on naming different fossil animals and modern day animals as well, but they essentially go, hey, yeah, Ubirajara, it's not a valid name, we're not treating it as a real name. What this means is that as this fossil is getting set up to be repatriated and sent back to Brazil, more Brazilian researchers will be able to look at it, research it, and decide what they actually want to name it, since technically they should have been the people with kind of the first right to actually look at these fossils. And when I say first right, I mean because Brazilian law says, hey, if you have a new thing, a Brazilian needs to also be included on this study. And it's a way for Brazil to actually encourage their own paleontological research and be able to better actually study what they have there, instead of waiting for it to be smuggled out of Brazil in 1995 and then take 20 plus years in order to actually study it, like happened with Ubirajara. Instead, it can be domestically held and studied by people who actually understand the full geologic context of where the fossil is coming from. And now, as we're pivoting into the scientific papers, there was one that looked at some really old algae fossils. And when I say really old, I mean between 900 and 950 million years old, making them at least 400 million years older than the Cambrian explosion. So really, really old fossils. And they found that there's actually a few different kinds of algae present, and some of them have been named, some of them haven't been named, but it just helps to show that there's a growing diversity of fossils from before the Cambrian explosion that we actually can start finding. And a lot of these were just kind of little tiny marks, and a lot of them were CT scans, so we can actually see them in a little bit better detail. So it's this kind of continuing process of finding fossils in older rocks than we normally find fossils in. And hopefully from that being able to understand how the different branches of life really came to be. Staying with algae, we're going to be looking at Protomelission, which Protomelission was normally found in the small carbonaceous fossils of the Cambrian, which is essentially just collections of tiny little pieces of fossils that we can't really tell what a lot of them are. A paper a year ago actually said, hey, Protomelission is probably the first bryozoan. Bryozoans are super common in the fossil record. They're these kind of frond or almost coral-like animals that lived colonially, and there's little holes in there that the little animal lives in and is able to pop out and filter feed and, do its life cycle. New fossils of Protomelission, though, coming from China are actually much more complete, by which I mean you have the entire thing and they can go, hey, this actually isn't a bryozoan, it's an algae. Which is unfortunate, because Protomelission was really thought of as the first bryozoan, and from what we know genetically, there should be bryozoans in the Cambrian. And so we thought we found them, and it turns out, no, we probably didn't. So hopefully we'll get a little bit better understanding of where exactly bryozoans came from in the future, but it looks like Protomelission isn't that answer. Staying with small carbonaceous fossils, the good thing about carbonaceous fossils is they're often preserved in things like calcite, which is a carbonaceous mineral. And that means that it can actually dissolve really easily. So if you have a fossil that's more resistant to acid, you can just throw the whole thing into acid and have those fossils just pop out. And that's what these researchers did, and what they actually found was a number of radula. Radula is something that's found in a lot of mollusks that they use for feeding. So it's essentially what's evolved into the beak in squid and cuttlefish, but also a lot of snails have them too, and they use it to scrape into their food or otherwise burrow into things like clams. These ones are interesting because they're actually super convergent with some modern day snails though. And when I say that, it's specifically the snails that scrape into algae like kelp and then essentially suck the sap out of it. They feed on the innards of that algae. So it seems like pretty early on in snail evolution, this niche developed. And unfortunately, because the radula are so small, we can't say they're directly related to the modern day snails that do this, but there is a chance that they were pretty consistent about living this kind of lifestyle. Then again, the snails could have radiated because they did experience mass extinctions, and so this may have just evolved multiple times after many of those different mass extinctions. On the subject of mass extinctions, there was one at the end of the Devonian, and this paper actually looked at just one basin which was being deposited during this time. And because the rocks were underwater originally and then lifted up onto land, there was a lot of geological forces included in their rising to the surface, which means a lot of these rocks are bent, but that also means that researchers could access a large swath of different rocks of different ages across this extinction. What they found were a lot of metals. In particular, molybdenum was one of the most important ones they looked at, and what that indicates is euxinic waters. Euxinic just means that it's anoxic, it lacks oxygen, but also that it's acidic. So you have things like acids being released into the water, which, as I mentioned before, you have these small carbonaceous fossils. The carbon dissolves in acid. So if you have something like a clam that's building its shell out of calcite and the water suddenly gets more acidic, it's not going to be able to build that shell as effectively. They also found that it was during the Hangenberg event, which was one of multiple climatic events that led to this extinction, there was the most severe amount of euxinic waters. So essentially, that's the main event that had the main kill mechanism for many of these animals, although there were multiple events before that that helped stagger some of the killing, and so essentially, it was many steps that led to this extinction. In fact, on one of these graphs, you can look beforehand, and you can see where the anoxic waters start, so when it starts losing oxygen, which obviously is also bad for these animals. However, one of the other graphs helps to show where the molybdenum was, and you can see that there was less of it in the deeper waters of this basin, meaning that essentially that may have served as a refuge for many of the organisms. And then as the euxinic waters were dispersed and it became more normal conditions, life could just respring from that deeper water. It's also important because it helps us understand why this extinction may have been so severe, because this period during the Devonian was characterized by a lot of shallow inland seas, and if the shallow waters are the ones where all these metals and euxinic waters are, that's going to have a really big impact on what's able to live in those shallow waters. It also is going to be things that are closer to shore and more likely to come up on land, which means those are the rocks we're mostly looking at, and so if everything's dying in those shallow water rocks that we have, that explains why the extinction looks the way it does. But the Devonian was just one of many mass extinctions, and this next paper tried to understand how predictable they might be, and for that they essentially just used AI learning tools. And so what they do is essentially if you're trying to teach it math, you would do 2 plus 2 and it would guess 3, and you go, okay, that's a little bit wrong, okay, fine. And then go 2 plus 2 is 2, and you go, okay, that's more wrong, so it leans closer to 3. And then eventually it'll start getting towards 4, and you can teach the AI tools to understand these different aspects of what's happening in an environment the same way. So essentially you start going, hey, there's an extinction event, there's this kind of acid being released into the water, what organisms go extinct? The nice thing about using this in the fossil record is we've looked at the fossil record for these mass extinctions before. We know which groups go extinct. For example, during the end Permian extinction, there's a large die-off of brachiopods. So if you run that through the computer and you go, hey, these are the conditions at the end Permian mass extinction, and it goes, all of the bivalves died and the brachiopods did great, you can tell it, no, that's not correct, and it'll start changing that model in order to try and predict it. And then hopefully you can just throw data into the simulation again, and it'll be able to predict then, based on what it's learned from the other past extinctions, what might go extinct in the future. What they found is it doesn't work very well. Essentially, it's still really hard, even with these varying conditions at different mass extinctions, to predict which groups might go extinct. There's certainly things that we can tell, and it's a useful tool for quantifying extinctions, but the way this model is built right now, it's not necessarily going to help us predict what might happen with modern day climate change, which would be really nice to know. The Triassic experienced a large diversification of many different kinds of life, and it was also bracketed by a mass extinction on both sides, one of the Permian into the Triassic, and one of the Triassic into the Jurassic. But one part in the middle of it was really important for that diversification, the Carnial pluvial event, when there was just massive widespread rains across the planet. This paper was looking at a chigutisaurid amphibian coming from India, and this would have been actually after the Carnian, so it's still important for understanding how the Carnian had an influence on the ecosystems of India during the Triassic. Compsogceps tikiensis is the first record of a chigutisaurid coming from the Tiki Formation of India, and this is important because during the Carnian a little bit earlier, the environment was mostly dominated by metoposaur amphibians. So these large things that honestly got pretty successful during the Triassic. There's even some near me in northern Arizona that are pretty plentiful. And at least in India, we're seeing this kind of faunal turnover, where these metopusaurid dominated environments start to become more chigutisaurid dominated environments. And we can't say exactly what it is, but it likely has something to do with the Carnian pluvial episode. And the thing is, we've been finding a lot more fossils from around this time in India specifically that have suggested a lot of very particular things about their waterways and how isolated they were compared to the rest of Pangaea. Because they were still all connected in Pangaea, but at least during this time in India, there wasn't a lot of migration, at least in some animals, between India and the rest of the continents. So there's something strange going on in the Carnian in India, and this fossil just helps to prove it, and hopefully there will be more research on this, which I expect is happening, because like I said, there's already other papers about fossils from the Carnian in India. Staying in the Triassic with some of those radiations, we're going to be looking at trilophosaurids, which were super bizarre. I mean, just look at this lower jaw. All of those flat ridges, those are the teeth. They're just super, super strange. And there's a new one coming from Germany that helps us understand them a little bit better. Rudiotomodon tythos is the new one coming from Germany. And it's able to actually help show a lot about how they kind of evolved, because it helps to fill in a little bit of a gap in trilophosaurid evolution. This is largely because it has some similarities with another animal that we thought might have been a trilophosaurid, but we couldn't tell for sure until now. That animal being much earlier in the Triassic and named Coleodontonathus rickovi. What this really helps to show us is the trilophosaurids were pretty successful. We have them from the very late Triassic, but then with the ones I just mentioned, they're much earlier in the Triassic. So they evolved early on after the mass extinction at the end of the Permian, and then just diversified and spread pretty well across Pangaea. Although I don't know if there's any coming from India right now. But that's not all, because they were also able to tell a little bit about their likely lifestyle. First of all, they probably had little beaks, and that means they were probably somewhat omnivorous, with the beaks being able to shear off different plant materials, but also them being able to catch smaller reptiles or even early mammals and eat those as well. And by looking at the jaws, they also found that they probably didn't spend a lot of time chewing. It was much more of a straightforward smashing rather than a proper chew with side-to-side movement. And that's really similar and means they were probably filling a similar niche to a modern day group of reptiles, the lizards. So essentially, they're lizards before lizards, at least as far as their niche was concerned. Although the first lizards were also evolving around this time. And then that mass extinction at the end of the Triassic killed off the trilophosaurids, but the lizards did well and were able to diversify into the wide breadth of niches they have today. And after that extinction at the end of the Triassic, a lot of the dinosaurs were able to diversify as well, including Sinosaurus, which comes from China. And it's actually kind of interesting because there's a great new skull of one of them, and it's Sinosaurus triassicus, but it's from the early Jurassic, not the Triassic, so naming can sometimes be incorrect. But the previous pieces that we had of Sinosaurus made us think it was related to Dilophosaurus from the early Jurassic of places like Arizona. It's actually the one that kills Wayne Knight in Jurassic Park, and it probably didn't have a frill and would have been much larger, but that's one that's pretty familiar for everybody to understand. And based on this new fossil of Sinosaurus, yeah, it almost definitely was closely related to Dilophosaurus, because it also has these two crests on top of its head. Now, there is actually another species of Sinosaurus known, Sinosaurus sinensis, but from what we know of it and what we know of Sinosaurus triassicus, Triassicus is unique for having these fenestra through the crest. Essentially, there's a hole that goes through it. And even Dilophosaurus, from what we currently know at least, doesn't have this. So they were doing something a little bit more unique than their other Dilophosaurine relatives. So hopefully we'll find a little bit more, and this paper is pretty much just a description of the skull. It doesn't really delve into what all of the different adaptations might have been for, but hopefully we'll get something like that, because these kinds of weird Dilophosaur theropod offshoots that didn't lead to any of the major radiations later in the Jurassic are super interesting to me. But dinosaurs weren't the only thing to radiate during the Jurassic. There were also plants, and a lot of new evidence has come out to help suggest that actually angiosperm plants were one of the major things to radiate during this time. In general, it's been thought that angiosperms, or flowering plants, only really started to develop and become dominant in environments during the Cretaceous. But like I said, there's been more and more finds of, hey, this might actually be a flowering plant. It might have a fruit, essentially. Kinganingen fructus is one example of these. It's a new genus of angiosperm plant coming from China. And like I said, there's been multiple of these that have already been described, but it's really just helping to pile onto this idea that, no, the angiosperms were actually around and doing pretty well by at least the Middle Jurassic. And hopefully we'll find more of them and more evidence of them, so we can try and be a little bit more definite on what exactly they were and how exactly they led to modern flowering plants. And as for things that would have been eating those plants, there were herbivorous dinosaurs that were also diversifying. And one of those was Scutellosaurus from the early Jurassic of Arizona. And it's interesting because it was one of the earliest known thyreophorans, which led to things like the stegosaurs and the ankylosaurs. And there's been a lot of debate as to whether it was bipedal or quadrupedal. And so these authors just made a very simple model with, small lines for muscles. They would have been larger, but they still get the point across. And were able to essentially just run it through the computer and see how effective it would have been at walking on 4 legs or on 2 legs. What they found is that Scutellosaurus, this early thyreophoran, probably mostly walked on 2 legs. And that does mean that at some point in the lineage that would lead to stegosaurs and ankylosaurs, there was a shift to quadrupedality. And that's actually kind of interesting because these dinosaurs are known for being very well armored. Even Scutellosaurus is armored. But an increase in that armor may have been part of the cause for them to actually shift to this more 4-legged stance. But there were still other dinosaurs radiating during the Jurassic, including Mamenchisaurs, which were a type of sauropod. And they're known for having really, really long necks. And this paper actually looked at one of the Mamenchisaurs, Mamenchisaurus sinocanidorum, in order to try and understand how exactly they were able to get their necks so massive. And what it looks like is their necks became much more rigid, rather than being able to bend side to side like we normally think about with many other animals such as Diplodocus. This rigidity in the neck, though, led to extreme pneumatization, meaning there were a lot of large air pockets in the neck that made it lighter. This then meant that neck could be up to 15 meters long, so pushing 50 feet for just the neck of this animal. It was massive. Now, we still need to do a little bit more study on how exactly this helped them compared to other sauropods, but it is really interesting to see. Additionally, the authors ran a phylogenetic analysis and found that despite having multiple species of Mamenchisaurus, a lot of them don't group closely together, so there needs to be some new names given for many of these animals. And that's a whole taxonomy thing. I'm planning on doing an entire separate video on taxonomy at some point, just because it can be really complex to understand how taxonomy works at times. Staying in sauropods, but this time going to the Cretaceous and into northwestern Europe, we have the first sauropods that are from a highland environment or an upland environment, as opposed to being in the basin or floodplain where we normally get most fossils from. And that's because basin or floodplains where there's a lot of mud being deposited, you can bury animals easier. This animal, though, is really unique for being preserved because there would have been mountains being uplifted and it would have been a limestone base rock. And what that means is limestone can dissolve. When I mentioned the carbonaceous fossils earlier and talked about how you can just throw it in acid and the things that aren't dissolvable pop out, that's basically what happened here. Is even in just normal water, limestone will slowly dissolve, and occasionally it forms caves. This is called a karst system. It's also the same reason you have a lot of big sinkholes in places like Florida. Their entire bedrock is limestone. This means that when one of these sauropods died, some of the bones washed into this cave or a chasm and then got buried by sediment. So it's really unique preservational conditions that led to us finding this animal at all. And it's pretty partial, so all we can really say is it's some kind of titanosauriform, meaning some of the really, really large sauropods. But it does also let us know that they were probably surviving at least a few hundred meters above sea level. And that means they were able to conquer a wide number of different environments. There was also a new study on Kansaignathus, which actually comes from Tajikistan, and it's interesting because this paper was actually looking more at that phylogeny, that taxonomy kind of thing. And what it found is that it's the earliest known velociraptorine dromaeosaur. The dromaeosaurs are more generally the raptor dinosaurs, and the velociraptorines are the ones that led to things like velociraptor. Shocking, I know that they're named so straightforward. But it does help us understand how early some of these would have been, as this one is from the early Cretaceous. But it's interesting that it is the earliest branching one, because importantly there are earlier velociraptorines, namely Deinonychus from North America. So what that means is that this branch that led to Kansaignathus had already diverged from the other velociraptorines, and then some of the velociraptorines migrated all the way into North America and became things like Deinonychus, but that same group that migrated to North America also eventually came back to Asia and became things like Velociraptor. Or potentially just one part of the population went out and became Deinonychus. It's really complex, but it does tell us a lot of the things about their biogeography and the fact that the velociraptorines were probably pretty successful once they first started to evolve and got around the world pretty rapidly. There were also some other biogeographic studies specifically about marine reptiles being far north in Eurasia. It's actually the furthest north they've been found in Eurasia, and it's interesting because it's mostly turtles, but also some of the long-necked plesiosaurs. And a lot of these plesiosaurs actually seem pretty young. What this might mean is that this very northern area of Eurasia may have actually served as a kind of nursery for many of these young animals. And obviously it wasn't perfectly safe because we have dead bodies of some of them, but that does mean that they were using specific areas that would have been safer in general, and that many of those areas would have been pretty far north, meaning that the cold water really wasn't a problem for them. And then we found something that's probably closely related to another group of animals that moved back to the water, in that it's probably closely related to whales and hippos, and that's entelodonts. Entelodonts, or hell pigs, have generally been considered to be closer to pigs, and there have been some people that have suggested no, they're probably closer to hippos, and a new one really helps to illuminate this. Entelodontellis zhaolingi lived during the late Eocene of China, millions of years before some of the more famous hell pigs like Daedon were around. This new material, especially since it's earlier in the lineage of things like Daedon, helps to really show that no, they probably were closer related to things like hippos and whales, although not directly related. Whales and hippos still would have been closer related to one another than the entelodonts would be to either of those groups. But it does also mean that the more hippo-like reconstructions you can see in some things, including the new project that's coming out, Forgotten Bloodlines Agate, where they have their own version of Daedon, are probably a little bit more correct than some of the older reconstructions you see in things like Walking with Beasts, where it's a little bit more wrinkly and mean pig-like. So still definitely would have been an animal you didn't necessarily want to interact with, but it is a little different than quite the, wrinkly monster of Walking with Beasts. Still in the Eocene, but going back to the beginning of the Eocene around 50 million years ago, there's a lot of new fossils of birds coming out of the Eocene London clay. And that's in large part because one of my Discord users mentioned that, hey, there's this guy who has a collection and he's finally giving it to researchers to study. So suddenly there's all these birds popping up from the London clay. And that's actually kind of useful because this was a major time of diversification for many of the modern bird groups we have. Sauroravis solitaris is the newest one of these London clay birds. And it's actually kind of interesting because it's very convergent on a modern day bird, the mouse birds, which often hang upside down and get at nectar and fruits in a somewhat strange way. And based on the ankles, it was very convergent on that, but also it wasn't directly related to them. Instead, it was closer to the passerine birds, which the passerines are most birds. It's like 60% of birds. If it's small and perches, it's a passerine. But also if it's as large as a crow and perches in the same way, it's also a passerine. Really successful group of birds. And immediately next to that group was the zygodactylids, which is a now extinct group of birds that had slightly different foot shape. Essentially, if you make a group that includes the zygodactylids and the passerines, this new animal is right next to it. And what that means is this kind of unique feeding behavior was probably somewhat important to the early evolution of the passerines, getting them up into trees and eventually leading to the passerine perching condition. And while not all passerines do the same kind of thing, it is still really interesting to see how the interaction with the plants around them really led to them becoming what they were, then diversifying into becoming one of the most successful bird groups there is. Still in birds, but moving much closer to the modern day, there was also a massive bird of prey found from Australia that lived probably only a few thousand years ago. And it's actually really interesting because it falls between two different groups of birds, which are both raptors, but are very different in the way that they actually function. Because one of them includes things like the Philippine eagle, which is a massive bird of prey, and the other group is vultures. So it's really interesting because it actually falls a little bit closer to the vultures, but based on the morphology of the foot, it had really, really strong feet that would have been pretty similar to the Philippine eagles. So the vultures group essentially probably had this kind of ancestral hunting condition and then just progressively ate more and more dead things already. And being able to get around and flying really helped facilitate that, but it's really interesting to understand how many of these animals would have started as hunters and then eventually evolved into scavenging. It also makes sense that it would have been so large because when you think about Australia a few thousand years ago, you have much larger animals, including a lot of large marsupials that it could have hunted. Also, relatively large lizards and things too. I mean, birds of prey aren't necessarily picky that often. And speaking of things scavenging, we're going to be looking at Thylacosmilus, which I had an entire separate video on, and one thing that I didn't really emphasize was that it either scavenged or it had a very unique hunting ecology, something that we just don't understand well. And I could have leaned into that. It's weird if it was hunting, kind of aspect a little bit more. However, this new study also just helped to throw a wrench into all of that potential hunting because they looked at its eyes and how its eyes would have been positioned. And they compared this to a lot of other animals that we know hunt, especially big cats. And what they found is Thylacolus, its eyes weren't necessarily quite as forward as they are in big cats. It still had a little bit of binocular vision, but not nearly as much as we would expect in main apex predators that we see today. So again, if it was doing something with hunting, it was doing something really, really unique. You can see this in some of the graphs too, where like the little red X's are Thylacolus, and they're just complete outliers compared to everything else that was tested. It's super strange to see that it wouldn't have had as aggressive a binocular vision, especially if it hypothetically at least was actively hunting. Now there is some error in this because there are variables we don't know, such as the size of the eye. If its eyes were smaller, they could have potentially rotated more forward, or potentially the eyes could have just been rotated more forward rather than pointing out directly from where the kind of nerve process in the back of the eye actually would come from. All of this to say that Thylacolus was an incredibly strange animal, and hopefully we get some more studies on it so we can try and figure out what it was doing. And staying in mammals, and even somewhat unique mammals, we're going to be looking at flying and gliding mammals. And this one doesn't actually look at the fossils, although we know some of these groups are pretty widely divergent. For example, you have bats, which are placental mammals, but then you also have sugar gliders, which are marsupials, not closely related at all. But when we look at their genetics, they actually use the same gene in order to grow the patagium, the little bit of flesh that helps them actually glide and or fly. This is really just to say that despite some very long divergences in evolutionary time, there are some pathways for certain traits that are conserved, where essentially this gene is the best at making this kind of patagium for a gliding membrane. So it's something that's really conserved in gliding and flying animals, or at least in the mammals that do that. So hopefully we'll be able to find a little bit more of these kinds of examples so we can try and better understand how evolution actually acts on specific genes and how much convergence there actually might be in the genetic record. And on the subject of DNA, we actually got something similar to DNA from something that's about 14.7 million years old. And it's just a fish, it's from an otolith, so an ear bone. And what they were able to do is actually find the proteome. So not the genome, not the DNA, but the proteome is essentially the makeup of all of the proteins that DNA is producing. And what the researchers found was actually some of the proteins are basically identical to the same proteins we see in related fish for their ear development. So it's a really good indicator that this is actually a really effective method for understanding what proteins different organisms were making. And now getting to things that I've already done entire separate videos on, we're going to be starting in the water still and looking at some of the oldest sea anemone fossils that there are coming from Mason Creek. And this is really exciting because it actually helps us understand a lot more about why Mason Creek has been so great for preservation, including preserving things like Toli monstrum, this really strange thing that I also have a separate video on. There's also some records of giant ants as far north as Canada, and it helps to show how the warm earth during the Eocene helped to facilitate their movement across the continents. I already mentioned the Permian Triassic extinction, and there is a very early ichthyosaur. The ichthyosaurs were the kind of dolphin-like reptiles that lived during the Mesozoic and would have swam around eating fish and things. And this one is much earlier and actually suggests that because it's so early after that extinction, the first ichthyosaurs may have already evolved before the Permian Triassic extinction and then just rapidly diversified after it. There was also a paper saying that Allosaurus was mostly a scavenger, and it's a really dumb idea, and I talk about why in my video. It's exhausting sometimes. And then finally, there was the paper that's, more known by the paleo community that talks about, hey, T-Rex and other theropod dinosaurs probably had lips. And there's a lot of heated comments on that video already because it's kind of a hot topic of, oh, did the teeth show or did they not? Based on this paper, no, they didn't. They had a fleshy lip covering and protecting the teeth when they were walking around. Some people are upset about that, but that's what the evidence says right now at least. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I do want to thank our patrons, Peter D., Josh Teifer, Richard Lord, Kathleen Waite, Derek Hudgens, Matthias Gubler, Rob Schneider, PA Brew News, Hunter Flick, Nate Surmeyer, Stana Forth Hopkins, Thomas Cadleck, Sean Cromit, Luke, Kirk Commands, Ertabbed, Steve Black, and Madeline Lockyer. Be safe, take care, don't go extinct.